Okay, so it's 2 p.m. We'll start in a second. Okay, welcome to Lesson 3 of Introduction to Python. Today we're going to be talking about lists and loops, and we're going to go over about 3 main concepts. We're going to go over lists and the commands, and then the 2 different types of main loops that will be shown. Okay, so what is a Python list? If you'll remember from one of the earlier weeks, we talked about variables, right? And with variables, there are different types. Can someone name one type of variable in the chat? Okay, right. So we have things like integers, strings, booleans, floats, and all of these can be put into a Python variable. But sometimes when we want to have multiple of these, we put it in what's called a list. Just like when we have a laundry list of items to get, a Python list can support multiple different types of variables. So as you can see in the example, we have this list with hi, bye, 1, and 2. And in this list, it's really important to note that we can have both strings and integers in one list, and we can have all different types in the same kind of list. So the majority of this will be about indexing, right? So when we talked about strings, we talked about how you can take every character in a string and you can give it a value from 0 to the end. And with lists, it's even easier. So for every value inside of a list, we can put and give it an index. And it's important to note that it's called an index. Just like in strings, indexes are going to start from 0 instead of 1. And as you can see, if we have this list right here, the values inside of this the values inside of this list are integers. And we can see that if we assign an index for each one of these values, we'll start from 0. So in this case, we'll have the list 0 giving to 0, and then 1 to the index 1, 2 to the index 2, and so on. And for the majority of things we can do with lists, the most important thing you need to remember is that the index is the position it's at, and the value is the actual value. So the index will always be a number from 0 on, but the value can be a string, an integer, anything really. Okay, so let's look at this example of a list. So at index 2, as you can see here, we have the value 2. So at, say, index 4, what's the value at index 4? Great, so the value is also 4. Okay, so let's try an example of a list real quick before we move on to modifying. If we have my list is equal to hello, goodbye, oops. What's going to be the value at the index 1 in this list, my list? Okay, so at index 1, it's important to note that if we start at 0, you can just count the amount. So we have at index 0, hello, and then at index 1, goodbye. And then we have at index 2, 3, and then 1, and true, and so on. So at index 1, the value would be goodbye. So modifying a list is basically changing the single values of a list. So in this example, we have my list as hi, bye, 1, 2, right? And as you can see, each one of these values is like an individual variable value. But if we want to change the value of just one of these, like if I want this list to be hi, bye, hello, to. Instead, I can directly change the value, and here indexes and values are important. So in order to change a value in a list, we can just put the list name, the index, and then we can set this to equal new value. Just like how we can give a variable name and then equal it to a new value, the index at in this list can be reset to a new value. So like if I have the list, my list, and then I want to change the second value, the value at index 2, I would go 0, 1, 2. The value at index 2 currently is 1, but since I'm reassigning the value, just like how I reassign the value at, just like how I reassign the value in a variable, I can reassign the value at the index and print it out. So like in this example, if I wanted to change the value at index 3, let's just say, what happens if I do my list 3 is equal to hi? Which value here is going to be changed first? Which value is going to be at index 3? Okay, so the current value at index 3 is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 1. And it's important to note that you always have to start, if you're going to count the index, you need to start counting here at 0. So the value at index 0 is hello. This is not index 1, this is index 0. So when we reassign this to hi, the value at index 3, which is currently 1, is going to be changed to hi. So we're going to have the new list of my list is equal to hello, goodbye, 3, hi, and true. And again, it's important to differentiate by the fact that this is the index and it has absolutely nothing to do with this value here. Indexes and values are two different things. So indexes are the positions and then values are the actual values. So if I change this, what would happen when I print this? Actually, what happens if I just print my list 3? What value does this print out? Okay, so it's going to print out hi because we set the value of my list 3 as hi. And one trick to remember is to think that whenever we put something in brackets, it's typically going to be an index instead of a value. So when we're printing my list 3, we're not printing out this 3. We're printing out the value at the index of 3, which in this case is hi. So if I print this out, it's going to be hi. Again, so for a list, we have different values inside of it. And sometimes you want to, if I have a laundry list and I want to see whether or not a certain value is inside this list, Python has a command called in. And what in does is it goes through the list and it sees whether or not the object is in the list. And it's going to have a true or false value. So in this example, we have my list here. The first thing we're going to print is hi in my list. And what this is asking is it's going to say whether or not the value of the string hi is in my list. So in this case, remember that this returns a true or false value. Is hi in my list? So since hi, the string, is in my list, we can see the value of this is true because you're basically asking a question. You're saying, is the value of this string inside this list? And if it is, you return true. Now what about this one? Is this value inside my list? What will this print out? Okay, so this is going to print out false because 3 is not in my list. And so if I have this value of my list, let's look at this example. If I want to print, so again, the value in will say whether or not it is inside this list. So if I want to ask whether or not the value of true is in my list, this command here will ask and say, is this inside my list? And it'll search through it. It'll go, this is not true, this is not true, this is not true, this is not true. And then it'll find whether or not true is inside my list. If true is in my list, it's going to actually return true. And then if it's not, it's going to return false. So what do you think happens when I print this piece of code out? Okay, so it's going to print out true because when we ask to see whether or not this value is in the list, it's going to find that this value right here is actually inside of this list, and it's going to print out true. But if I were to instead ask if a value like 2 is in my list, what would this print out? Yeah. Right, so it's going to print out false because it'll search this entire list and then it will find that the value of 2 is actually not inside this list and therefore it'll print false. And later when we go on to loops, there'll be another way to do this. So for now, let's move to the next thing. Sometimes when you have a list, you need to add items, right? You're adding items, getting rid of items because it's a list. In Python, in order to add an item, we have to append it. And appending automatically adds it to the very end of the list. So if I want to append a value, let's just say hello, to this list, it's going to add the value of the string hello at the very end and it's going to print, and if I print out the list, it's going to be this list, and at the very end, we're going to have this value that we appended here. So right now, how many values are in my list right now? Great, so there are 5 items currently. But if I'm going to append another item, so to append it, the syntax for this is going to be the list name dot append, and then in parentheses, we're going to write, for example, hi. How many items will this have? If I print out my list, how many items will it print out? Okay, so it's going to print out 6 items because we're just adding the value of hi to the end of my list. Notice that we're not changing any of these current values. We're just adding another value at the end. So if we print it out, it's going to print out 6 items. Okay. Since we can add items to a list, we can also get rid of items. And this is where indexing and value comes along. So indexes, again, I'm going to repeat, is the position. Value is the actual value. So the position here is 0, but the value is hello. And if we want to get rid of an item, there are two main ways we can go and remove it. And the first way is by the value. So right here, I've added the value of hi to my list, right? So my list currently looks like this. But if I want to get rid of an item, the first thing I can do is use remove. So I go, let's pretend this isn't here. My list dot remove, and then here I'm going to go with the value of the item. So here, if I put hello, it's going to remove the item with the value of hello. So if I print this out, what will this print? Okay, so it's going to print out the same list without the value of hello. So since we removed this value, we are going to print out goodbye 3, 1, true. Now let's say I'm going to remove, this is a slightly harder question, so make sure you think about it before I go. If I remove 3, which value is going to be missing from this list when I print it out? Great. So since we're removing the value, not the index, since we're removing the value inside of the list with the value of 3, we are going to actually remove this. We're not going to remove the value at index 3. We're going to remove the part of the list that has the value of 3, if that makes sense. So again, it'll just remove the actual value of 3. And then the second way is sometimes you don't know the value of what you're removing. So you need to remove it by the index. What we can do is we can use del, short for delete, and then list name, my list, and then here, instead of putting the value, we're going to put the index. So if I put, again, 3, what item is this going to delete? Great, so it's not going to delete the actual value of 3, it's going to delete the one at position 3. And in this case, that's going to be 1. So if we print this out, it's still going to have 3, but the 1 will be missing. Let's try some more examples. If I first remove, let's go through this code. If I remove the value of 2 here in this list, here, am I removing the value at index 2 or value 2 using remove. We are actually going to be doing a Kahoot later, like in the 10 minutes left of class. Yeah. Okay, so if we remove a value here, if we use dot remove, are we going to remove the value at index or value 2? Great, so with dot remove, we get rid of the value. Sorry, we remove the part of the list with the value at 2. So what if we delete my list 2? Are we going to get rid of the index or the value of 2? For delete. Okay, so first of all, delete is going to be the index. And then the other thing is someone asked, why do we need brackets and not parentheses? In Python, the syntax is really important. So parentheses are used for some things and brackets are used for other things. As you can see, we use parentheses for for different things, but for example, we put parentheses around print sometimes. And then the brackets, the easiest way to think about it is there's no concrete reason, but brackets are used for things related to lists and indexes. So the brackets, for most things related to lists, anything inside brackets are going to be the indexes or the actual list. The next smaller concept we're going to be talking about is range. And what range does is it directly creates a list of integers with a certain range. And there are three main parameters. So when we type in range something, the parameters are going to be the things inside of the parentheses. And so we're going to have one called start, and it's just whatever value we start at. Then we're going to have stop, which is whatever the value we're going to stop at, but it's not going to be included. And then we have step. This might not make sense exactly, but let's look at some examples. If we use a range with three parameters, what does this 0 mean? Okay, so the thing with parameters is basically we have values inside of these parentheses, right? So we're going to go in this order. We're going to have the first value being the starting value, the second being the stopping value, and then the third being the stepping value. And one thing that's cool about this is if we set the starting value to 0 and then the step value to 1, we can put any value at the stop. And Python does this cool thing where it automatically is able to give you a value of start and step. So it'll have a default value for range, meaning if I only put one value here, it's going to assume that this is the number that we stop at. If I put z equals range 10, as you can see here, it's going to generate a list with step 1, because we step 1 and increase by 1 every time, and starting number 0, and it's going to go from 0 all the way to 9, which is 10 minus 1. And the idea of this is this value, for range, all we need is the ending value. But if we want to change something, like if I want to increment by 2 instead of 1, what I can do is I can add the starting value here. Okay, let's try kind of like an example. If I have range 5, if I print out my list, it's going to give me a value of all of the numbers from 0 to up to 5, which is 0 to 4, and they're going to increment by 1 because that's the automatic value. But if I want to start at 1, I'm going to put 1 here, and Python is going to automatically read this as start, stop. Because I haven't included a step, it's just going to step by 1. And then if I actually want to increment by, say, 2 each time, I'm going to be putting a 2 at the very end. And then what this does is it gives all three values, and it's going to say, I start at value 1, I stop at value 5, and I'm going to increment by 2 each time. And then these two, technically with Python, these two, if I omit these, it's just going to assume that this value right here is the stopping value. So if I do range 9, the 5 doesn't show up. I'll explain this kind of later, but the idea is when you do range, it's going to give all of the values from 0 up to that number. So it's going to go all the way up to, and then once it sees 5, it's not going to include 5. Yeah, you can kind of think of it as this is the almost greatest value the smallest value it can't go to. So once it sees 9, it's going to not print it out. It's just going to go all the way up to 9. Okay, this is the part that's like the second half. We're going to talk about loops. Sometimes if I want to say execute a code multiple times, or let's say I want to print out the value of hi, multiple times, right? Let's say I want to print out the value of hi 3 times. So what I could do is I could go hi, 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 and then copy and paste every time I want to print it out. Or I could just have and use what's called a loop. A loop is, there are two main types of loops, for loops and while loops, but both of them accomplish the same thing. They're going to both execute a block of code multiple times. The first type is called a for loop. So let's say I want to execute and print out all the values from 0 to 5, inclusive. What I could do is I could directly print 0, 1, 2, all the way up to 5. Or what I can do is use for I in range. And the syntax of a for loop is going to be, well, for I in, and for now let's go range, as in the range function we were talking about earlier. And again, as someone asked earlier, we're going to go all the way up to 6, but we're not going to include 6. So if I were to print I, what I does is I finds the value inside of range that it currently is. It's going to print out all of the values all the way up to 5, starting with 0. So if I print out for I in range 20, what's the biggest number? What's the biggest thing that's going to print out? What's the biggest number? Good. So 19 is the biggest number it's going to print out. What's the smallest number? Okay, so we're going to start from 0 and it's going to print all the way up to 19. Okay, so in the range, again, we're going to use the range function. I is going to be what's called an iterator, and you don't really need to remember this word. It's just like a terminal, like a term. And 20 is going to be, 6 is going to be the amount of times it runs, but when we use range, it's going to go, so the value of I is going to go from 0 all the way up to the value in here. So in this example, I is going to go from 0 all the way up to 5. And in range, again, 3 values are possible. We can have the starting, the value, and then the incrementation. But typically when you use a for loop, you're not going to use I that much. Like, it's just going to let you repeat the code. So what this is basically is it's going to be telling you the amount of times that this code runs. So let's say I put 3 here. How many times are we going to print a value? Okay, let's say I want to print, again, hi. How many times are we going to print out hi? Okay, we're going to print out hi 3 times because even though we start at 0 and we go up to 2, so if I were to print out I, what it would do is it would print it out 3 times. Sorry, if I were to print out I, this would be I at value 0, this would be I at value 1, and then I at value 2. So even though the greatest value of I is 2, since it starts with 0, it's still going to go out 3 times. This is a little bit confusing, but you'll get used to it. So another thing we can do is instead of going I in range, this is where for loops and lists both work together. We can go inside of a list. And while earlier the value of I might have been like an iterator or the number, you can think of it kind of like an index. Right now, if we iterate through a list, it's going to be the value. So let's make my list again. Equals hi. No, it's not supposed to happen. Okay, so if I were to iterate for I in my list, what this does is if I were to print out I, if I went in range, I would be a value incrementing from 0 to whatever the last value of range is, -1. But if I were to go in my list, what I is I is going to be the value inside of my list, and it's going to go and execute this block of code however long my list is. So if I were to kind of go through this code, what it would look like is for I in my list, the first time around, I is going to be the value at index 0. So what value is that? Okay, so the value of I is going to be high the first time. And then the second time we'll print I, and then the second time we're going to go, and I is going to be the value at index 1. We're iterating the second time, but it's going to be the value at index 1. So what value is that? Okay, great. So we will go to the value of at index 1, which is by, and then it'll print that out, and then it'll keep going. The important thing to note is I, in this case, doesn't really mean anything. Right here, I serves as like a variable. We can use any value. If I use X, or I can do time, or make any, I can do this, this value here, it can be anything, as long as it's like a valid variable name. So I usually stands for iterators, so people usually use I. And it's a good habit to try and use the same or similar things for your for loop, for this value here in your for loop. So if I were to print out I, what it would print out is all of these values inside of my list. So let's say I still want to print out all of the values from 0 to 5. What I could do, as shown here, is I could just make a list with the values of 0 to 5. And then I could iterate through the list, printing out all of the values, and I would still get all the values from 0 to 5. The other cool thing about this is that so the value of I is going to be the value, and then it's going to run for the length of the list. And if you remember, okay, so I is going to be the value of the value inside of the list, and it's going to iterate through all of these values, and it's going to run for the length of the list. Does anyone remember the len function, or the value of len? What does that do? Okay, so what the len value is going to do is it's going to return the length of the list. So if I print out len and then my list, what value is this going to print out? What's the length of this list? Okay, so it's going to be printing out 4, because the length of this list is 4. And the hardest part of lists that people usually get confused on is the difference between indexing and length. So the index of this value is 0, but the index of this value is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, but the total length of this is still 4. The easiest way to remember indexing is that since indexing starts with 0, the last index is going to be 1 less than the total length. So if I print it out, it's going to print out 4 and not 3. So what I can do is that sometimes if I want to use the index in the list, if I want I for, let's use X this time, in range, what I can do here is I can run it for the length of my list. And what happens here is what we're basically saying is X is going to be the values from 0 all the way up to the length of my list. So if I print X, what's the greatest value of X that's going to print? Great, so the greatest value is going to be 3, because if I print it out, it's going to go and print the indexes from 0 to 3. And as I mentioned, earlier in this lesson, we mentioned to find a value in a list based on the index. What we can do is we do my list and then bracket the index. And in this case, if I want to find out the index, let's say the index is X. This loop right here is actually going to print out the exact same thing as this loop. So if I were to directly, let's use a different variable. Okay, so in this loop, what we're saying is we're going to go in range the length of my list. So it's going to go in range 0 to 3. and it's going to print out the value at my list index x. But for this loop, what we're saying is we're directly iterating through, directly going through the list. So I is going to be the value. I is going to be high, and then by, and then 3, and so on. And we're going to print out I. So these loops are going to print out the exact same thing. The second main type of loop is going to be a while loop. And what a while loop is it's a loop that goes on over and over again until a condition is satisfied. And again, here is where Boolean is important. So a way to think about while loops is it's basically a never-ending loop that only stops once this condition that's going to be shown, go back, that this condition, which is going to be shown here, whether it's only going to stop when this is false. So it's like if I want to loop with an if almost. I don't know if that makes sense. So let's say I have a value called variable. Let's just variable. This variable x is going to be equal to 0. And I'm going to say while x is greater than while x is less than 3, we're going to add 1 to x. So we're going to do x equals x plus 1. And then another way to actually, So what we're going to see here is it's going to run. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of see how this would run. The first time we go through this loop, x is going to be equal to 0. And since x and 0 is less than 3, this is going to be true, and we're going to go into this next statement. So we'll increase 1 to x, and x is going to be 1. Then it's going to run again because this statement is true, and we can keep running. The second time we run it, x is going to be equal to 1, and since 1 is still less than 3, this value is true, and we're going to go in and execute this code, which is going to put x as x plus 1. So x is going to be equal to 2. Then we're going to keep running. Well, 2 is less than 3, so we're going to run this piece of code again. And when we run this, we're going to add 1 to the value of x, and now x is 3. So when we go back into this while loop, we're going to have 3 less than 3. And since this statement is now false, since x is 3, we're going to exit the while loop, and then the program will be done. So from 0 all the way up to 3, how many times does this loop run? So x starts at 0, and every time we add 1 to x until x is equal to 3, right? So it's going to run 3 times. So if I print the value of x here, what values do you think this would print out? Great, so it's going to print out the values of 0, 1, and 2 because we're going while this is less, and then, we're going to be iterating through this 3 times. And Python, so the thing with Python is sometimes with while loops, this condition is never going to be false. And this is going to, so let's say I change this to less than. So while x is less than 3, we print x, and then we keep adding 1 to x. Here's the question. How many times would this loop potentially run? Okay, so there's no actual number because it would run an infinite amount of times. X is never going to, wait, x is, right, x is, sorry, it's not going to run an infinite. I wrote this wrong. While x is greater than -1, how many times would this run? Sorry, that was a mistake. great. This is going to run an infinite amount of times. It's going to run forever because x will always be greater than -1. So Python is a pretty smart platform. What it's going to do is it's going to, well, first it's going to do that, but typically if it can recognize it, it's going to run an error. So like if, it's just going to run on and on forever. But in the other case, let's say x is greater than 3. How many times would this while loop run? So remember, as soon as this statement is false, it doesn't execute this code. So if this statement is false, it's never going to execute this while loop. The value is going to be 0. Okay. So with while loops, when you program while loops, you have to be really careful because there are so many ways that it could go on forever, basically. One easy way to see it go on forever is just to say while true. How many times would this run? Sorry, will this ever be false? Great, it's never going to be false because we're literally saying while true. And since this is never going to change, it's just going to, again, run on forever. Another thing that's not as obvious is that if I have a condition that, let's say, x is greater than -1 again, if I don't increase the value of x, if I comment this out, remember commenting it out means that this code pretty much doesn't exist anymore. It's just going to go on forever because x hasn't changed. So when you use while loops, you need to make sure that this value is going to be changing, that it's never going to be always true or always false, because otherwise it's just not going to run right. Okay, two things we're going to go over right now are going to be called break and continue. So break is a great way to try and help a while loop. And what break does is it basically stops loop. As soon as Python sees the code of break, it's just going to end the loop no matter what. So let's say I use this code of while x is less than 3. I have x, I increment x1 every time, but I'm also going to say if x is 2, I'm going to break. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying as soon as, so this while loop is going to run everything inside of this code. So what it's going to do is it's going to say, okay, 0 is less than 3, so this is true. I'm going to add 1 to x, so the value of x is now 1. And then I'm going to run this if statement. If x is equal to 2, I will break. If not, I continue. Now the tricky question is, how many times will this while loop run? Okay, so if we actually run this, I'm going to print out x. What's going to happen is it's actually only going to run. Okay, I'm going to move this forward. It's actually only going to run 2 times. Because what happens is break says that no matter what happens, I'm going to exit this loop. So I'm going to print out x. So x is going to be 0, and then I'm going to add 1 to x. It's going to see this if, and as soon as x is equal to 2, which is going to happen when we add 1 to x, it's going to break the loop. So even if this condition is still true, if I break, the entire loop is done. The other thing is continue. What continue says is that continue's typically not used as much, but what continue says is that basically do nothing. So if I were to print this one out, how many times would this while loop run? Okay, so it's actually going to run 3 times till the value of 2. And I'm going to try and clarify this a little bit more. So what we're going to do is we're going to add 1 to the value of x. And as soon as as soon as we go into this if statement, what it's going to do is it's going to do absolutely nothing. It's going to continue, and this might seem useless now, and by itself it is. So if we just say continue, what this basically is saying is that, oops, if I didn't include this, it's exactly the same because we're just saying continue. If this is true, it goes in and it continues on this loop. And the idea of this is when I put an else and then I say else break, what this does is I have x as the value of 0, and then while x is less than 3, first I'm going to print x. So what value would I print out the first time for x? Great, so I'm going to print out the value of 0. And then once I print out the value of 0, I'm going to increase 1. So 0 plus 1 is 1, so the value of x is 1. And then I'm going to say if x is equal to 2, I'm going to continue. And since x is not equal to 2, I'm going to go to the else statement. And I'm going to go here, which says break. And again, break is just saying exit the loop no matter what. So I'm going to exit this loop, and the loop will be over, and so will the code. So in this case, it will only actually run once. Do the idea of break and continue kind of make sense? Okay. So now let's go over some examples and problems before we move on. Take a look at this code. What do you think this is going to print out? Okay, great. So if we kind of look through this code, it's going to say while count is less than 10. So it'll run for all the values where count is 0 to 9. First we add 1, and then if count is 11, since it will never reach 11, this is never printed, but at one point when count is equal to 2, we're going to print out by. And so this entire code is only going to print out the word by. Okay, for this one, the first week I believe I asked for like Python platforms like StarCode or Playground, try printing this code out, like actually running it. And then copy and paste your results into, or just type in the results of what it's going to print out. Okay, so if we actually type this in, we're going to type in list is equal to, great, 1, 2, 3. Oh, sorry, this semicolon here shouldn't be there. And then we're going to print out list 1 is equal to 4. So the thing you'll note about this actual code is it's going to run a couple of errors for a couple of reasons. First of all, as we mentioned in our first class, this is a keyword and it doesn't work. And then the other thing is I have the semicolon here for no reason. Anyway, so it's going to print out 1, 4, and 3. And since we have about 10 minutes left of class, let's move to the Kahoot. And again, so the idea of this is you don't have to join, but it'd probably be beneficial. And we're going to go over all of the questions as usual. So again, we're just going to go to kahoot.it and then we're going to join with this code. Okay, great. So if we review this, again, when we put the 0 here, it's going to print out the value at index 0. And in this case, the value at index 0 is going to be 1. Okay, so if we kind of look through this list, we're going to go for I in list. And in this case, the value of I is going to be the value inside of the list, not the index. So if I equals 3, it's going to print I. So we're going to go 0, 1, 2. Wait, why is 5 the right answer? Okay, I'm sorry, that appears to be a mistake. It is actually going to be 3 if I is 3. So sorry about that. I'm just great. So in this case, it's going to print for I in list. If I is 3, it's going to print out the value of 3. And it is actually going to print because there is a 3 inside of the list. Okay, I'm going to kind of review this as the Kahoot goes on. So the basic idea of this is while I is in the list, so while the value of I is in the list, we're going to increase the value of I by 1. And since I is 1, what it's going to do is it's going to find what the I inside list, and since 1 is in the list, it's going to execute. It's going to go I is equal to I plus 1. And then this is going to go on all the way until I has the value of 6. And when I has the value of 6, it's no longer in the list. So the code is going to run 5 times because from the values from 1 to 5. Here, remember that the index and the values are totally different. So anything inside of these brackets is going to refer to the index, and then these values, these are going to be the actual values. That's right. Great. So what it's going to do is it's going to what we're going to do is, since this doesn't actually affect what we print out, it's going to print the value at list 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, and that's actually going to be 4. Okay, so this one should be slightly easier. So it's basically going to print whether or not 7 is in list, and since 7 is not inside of the list, the value is going to be false. Okay, so here the idea is that when we print 2 in list, it's going to see whether or not the value of 2 is inside of the list, and it's going to print out as true. So again, range is going to be all of the numbers starting from 0 to up to 4. So it's going to be 0, 1. Oh, wait, I'm giving away the answer. But it's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, basically. Okay, so it's going to be all of values from 0 to 3. Oh, sorry, that was an error for the last question. Okay, so for this one, since the value is false, it's never going to run because the value is always going to be wrong and it's going to be false. So it's not going to run at all. So pay attention to that the value of break is just going to directly break the loop. Great, so since even though it's going to directly break it, we're still going to run it at least once. So it's going to go in, and since this is true, we're going to run it here once, and then it's going to break. So we're only going to execute the code once. So sorry for the mistakes in the Kahoot, but okay, so good job, and that's the end of today's lesson. So see you guys next week.